You're walking through the moonlit alleys of 18th century Paris, and the smell hits you first. A thick, almost personal stench. Not perfume, not fresh bread. No, human waste. Gallons of it. And guess who's wading knee-deep through it like some unsung sewer saint? You. Congratulations. You're a night soil man. A job so disgusting, so critical, and so absurdly underpaid. It makes modern gig work look like luxury. They say history is glamorous. Powdered wigs, glittering salons, revolutions. But let's talk about the real crap. Literally, because someone had to clean up after the Enlightenment. And that someone was probably you. Stick around if you've ever wondered who cleaned the chamber pots of Voltaire's Paris. Like, subscribe, and light a candle. It's about to get filthy, fascinating, and unexpectedly human. Ah, Paris, the city of lights. A place of grandeur, of romance, of towering cathedrals and powdered wigs. A city where every cobblestone whispers tales of philosophers, painters, revolutionaries, and about 600,000 people who all had to poop somewhere. Let's not kid ourselves. Behind the rose-tinted lens of period dramas and over-glossed history books lies the grittier, smellier truth. Before we can talk about the men who shoveled the filth, we need to understand just how much filth we're talking about. 18th century Paris was a masterpiece of art and architecture, but it was also quite literally built on crap. You see, in pre-revolutionary France, toilets were a luxury item. Indoor plumbing, reserved for palaces, monasteries, and the occasional aristocrat who had read a suspicious amount of Roman engineering manuals. For everyone else, the bathroom was either a wooden bench with a hole in it perched precariously over a pit, or, more commonly, a ceramic pot that you tucked under your bed and hoped wouldn't tip over during the night. And when morning came, well, the ritual was simple. Step 1, open your window. Step 2, yell, garde à l'eau, which translates roughly to watch out for the water. Step 3, heave the contents of your chamber pot directly into the street below. If you were feeling especially generous, you might aim for the gutter. Most didn't. Now imagine hundreds of thousands of people stacked in tightly packed tenements repeating this process daily. Multiply that by hot summer days, a complete lack of storm drains, and a general disdain for hygiene, and voila, Parisian perfume. Not the bottle, the air. You couldn't escape it. Merchants hawked their wares next to puddles of human waste. Children played in alleys, glistening with a mystery sheen that you absolutely did not want to investigate. Stray dogs, rats, and flies made entire careers out of following the sewage trails down the hills and into the Seine. Let that sink in for a second. The Seine, the same river that people used for bathing, drinking, fishing, and occasionally disposing of dead bodies, was also the city's de facto sewer system, which, when you think about it, really adds flavour to those romantic boat tours, doesn't it? But don't worry, the city officials weren't entirely asleep at the wheel. They made periodic attempts at public sanitation, most of which ranged from mildly helpful to completely laughable. One edict asked Parisians to build cesspits under their homes. Another banned dumping chamber pots from windows altogether, which was about as effective as telling a toddler not to eat crayons. People still did it. They just got better at ducking afterward. Now, let's talk infrastructure, or the lack thereof. The medieval street plan of Paris resembled a tangled mess of spaghetti left out in the rain. Narrow alleys, crooked buildings, and a baffling absence of drainage meant that anything spilled on the street had an annoying tendency to stay there for days, sometimes weeks. During heavy rains, the streets became rivers. During heat waves, they became gas chambers. And into this delightful urban ecosystem strolls the Enlightenment, that shiny period of reason, science, and rationality. While Rousseau pondered the nature of man and Voltaire sharpened his sarcasm, Parisians waded ankle-deep in a communal soup of effluence. The irony is almost too perfect. What's worse, the poor were hit hardest. The working class, those living in the outer arrondissements or in overcrowded slums, didn't even have the luxury of a halfway functional cesspit. Their options were limited. Pay someone to carry away your waste, dump it illegally, or, and this was depressingly common, dig a shallow hole, pray for rain, and move on with your life. Now picture this. It's late at night, the lamps flicker. The cobblestones are slick with, well, let's not be poetic. You step outside to fetch water or chase your runaway chicken, and you're hit with the aroma of Parisian nightlife. a heady blend of sweat, candle smoke, horse droppings, and the unmistakable stench of 600,000 digestive systems in daily synchrony. Romantic? Not quite. And yet, amidst all this, people carried on. Bakers still baked. Lovers still loved. Revolutionaries still plotted over mugs of sour wine. Life, it turns out, is astonishingly resilient, even when you're basically living inside a centuries-long porta potty. So here's the question, the one they never ask on history exams. What happens when an entire city uses the same streets as a toilet? Who cleans that up? Who volunteers to clean that up? And why did they keep doing it? Night after night, year after year. Enter the night soil men. The shadowy figures of urban survival. The unsung sanitation soldiers of Enlightenment Paris. They'll make their grand and grotesque entrance in the next chapter. But for now, just breathe that in. Dust, decay, history, and something else you really hope is just mud. So, you've taken a stroll through 18th century Paris. You've heard the chamber pots crash, smelled the sidewalks, and somehow lived to tell the tale. But now it's time to meet the men who didn't just survive the stench, they embraced it, not spiritually, physically, every night, up to their knees. Introducing the Night Soil Men, or as they were affectionately and semi-sarcastically nicknamed in Parisian slang, the gros bouches, or big mouths. Not because they talked a lot. Oh no, that would have required breathing. These men had the kind of big mouths that implied they could inhale ungodly stench and carry on like they were sipping soup. They were the unthanked custodians of civilization, the backstage crew of humanity's least glamorous performance. These weren't guys with options. Nobody dreamed of becoming a night soil man. No one wrote school essays titled "When I grow up I want to shovel poop in the dark," and yet, there they were. Every night, lantern in one hand, shovel in the other, and dignity, well, somewhere beneath the boots. To be clear, they weren't city employees. No uniforms, no benefits, no romantic scenes where a lady peers through the fog and falls for the brave man beneath the manure. These were private contractors before that term got swallowed by the gig economy. They were hired on a casual basis, often by building owners, sometimes by local parishes, and occasionally by desperate residents who hadn't budgeted for waste removal, but had definitely overachieved in the bowel department. Their work began after midnight, always. You didn't want to see them, and they didn't want to be seen. They moved through alleyways like ghosts, heaving buckets, dragging carts, avoiding eye contact, and praying to whatever god tolerated their line of work that the ladder didn't break again. No one greeted them. No one tipped them. No one invited them in for soup. They were tolerated, like rats or tax collectors. Essential, but better left out of polite conversation, which is rich, considering the alternative to their services was literal rivers of human waste flowing past your window. And yet, there was something oddly noble about it. Picture a Parisian street at 3 a.m. The stars above, the flicker of a lantern below. A man climbs down a splintered ladder into a cesspit that hasn't been emptied in 6 years. The fumes rise, his boots sink, his face contorts into a permanent expression of "don't breathe, don't gag, don't die," and he scoops, one load at a time, in silence. Because silence is faster than vomiting. You have to wonder, why would someone take this job? Well, one answer is simple: poverty. For many, especially immigrants and rural migrants, it was either the pit or starvation, and in a cruel twist of urban logic, the worse the job, the more stable the pay, sort of, depending on the season. And whether your competitors stole your route, and whether you passed out from ammonia fumes halfway through. Another reason, anonymity. You didn't need references, you didn't need connections, just a strong back, a stronger stomach, and a willingness to disappear into the dark with a bucket of someone else's regrets. There's also the social invisibility. For some, especially those who'd been rejected by other trades, being unseen had its perks. Nobody asked questions. You could be a former criminal, a failed cobbler, a runaway serf. As long as you could lift and didn't complain about smelling like boiled diapers, you were in. But let's be clear, this wasn't a brotherhood of grinning masochists. There was no camaraderie, no locker room chants, no annual banquets where everyone shared stories of the best pile of the year. It was lonely, backbreaking, dangerous work, and it came with zero upward mobility. The best you could hope for was not dying in a pit or catching dysentery from a splashback. Yet, they kept showing up. Why? Maybe it was that strange, stubborn thing humans do. The part of us that adapts, adjusts, perseveres. Maybe it was a quiet form of pride, buried deep beneath the grime. A belief, however subconscious, that what they were doing mattered, that even if no one said it, even if no one clapped, even if no statue would ever bear their name, someone had to clean up the mess. And it sure as hell wasn't going to be the guy in the powdered wig. Let's not romanticize it too much, though. These men were not saints. Some were aggressive. Some were thieves. Some drank themselves into stupors between shifts, just to dull the memory of whatever godforsaken substance had dripped onto their collarbone. But they showed up. And when they didn't, well, the results were immediate. Cesspits overflowed. Streets reeked worse than usual. Tenants complained. Landlords shrugged. And the rats? Oh, they thrived. Give a rat a river of filth, and he'll build a kingdom. But here's the kicker. Despite their crucial role, night soil men were often blamed for the very filth they removed. Think about that. You're hauling human waste out of the city so people don't die of disease. And those same people are crossing the street to avoid your smell. The hypocrisy? Chef's kiss. So what does it say about a society when the most essential workers are the most invisible? When the men who make the city livable can't live decently themselves? It says a lot about them. And maybe about now too, because every generation has its night soil men. People who do the work nobody wants to talk about until it doesn't get done. And next, we're going to follow one of them. Not theoretically, not as a symbol, but literally, step by step, shovel by shovel, into the depths of his job description. Because once you see what these men did, and how, you might just thank your toilet the next time you flush. So you've met the night soil men, our reluctant heroes, our olfactory martyrs, our municipal ghosts of the midnight hour. But let's not stop at vague admiration. Let's take a magnifying glass to their actual job, the daily grind, if by grind you mean scraping half-digested soup off stone walls with a wooden spade at 3 in the morning. Because it wasn't just cleaning up. That's far too generous a euphemism. It was a step-by-step descent into the fragrant underworld of Enlightenment-era urban living. And it had very specific steps. Let's walk through them, carefully. Try not to slip. First, the shift began long after the city had gone to bed. Midnight was prime time. Not because the smell got better, it didn't, but because people were less likely to see you and feel the need to announce how much you stank. The night soil man would gather his tools, a shovel, a long-handled rake, maybe a rope, and a bucket, or two, depending on the scale of horror waiting him. If he was lucky, the cesspit had an access door. If he wasn't, it meant lifting floorboards, or squeezing through basement hatches that seemed designed by a sadistic architect with a grudge against the human spine. And once inside, welcome to the pit. And I do mean pit. Sometimes 6 feet deep, sometimes more. A black, oozing vat of decades-old filth that had fermented into something halfway between solid and spiritual. The walls sweated. The air shimmered. The stench. You didn't just smell it. It entered you like a curse. Now comes the fun part. Descending into it. Ladders were provided. Theoretically, usually rotting wooden ones. Handmade and questionably stable. The man would climb down slowly, testing each rung like it might collapse, because it absolutely might collapse, until he reached the bottom, where his boots immediately vanished into the floor like he'd stepped into wet cement made of other people's secrets. Then the shoveling began. You didn't just remove waste, you had to do it strategically. A good night soil man knew how to read the cesspit, where the crust floated, where the liquid pooled, where the gas pockets lurked, waiting to belch like a demon with gastrointestinal trauma. He'd scoop the muck into a bucket, then haul it up manually or pass it to a partner, bucket after bucket, hour after hour. His muscles screamed, his lungs burned, his eyes watered involuntarily, not from emotion, but from the chemical warfare occurring beneath his nostrils. And this, somehow, was the easy part, because once the buckets were full, they had to be carried back up through cellars, through hallways, sometimes up rickety stairs with ceilings so low you had to crouch like a crab. Every spill was a minor catastrophe, every splash a potential infection, And no, there weren't gloves. Gloves were for nobles, not for the men removing human effluence with bare, blistered hands. The waste was then poured into carts. Wooden, creaky, unlined carts that leaked with every jolt. These carts would be wheeled through the city, under cover of darkness, toward dumping sites far from polite society, assuming no one stopped you, no wheels broke, and no one decided to rob you, because yes, even poop carts got hijacked. Why? We'll get to that in another chapter. But back to our guy. He's now 3 hours into his shift. He hasn't eaten since yesterday. He's soaking wet, covered in other people's regrets, and navigating cobblestones slicker than an eel in butter. He still has 2 more cesspits to clear before sunrise. And he's not just fighting waste, he's fighting time. Because if dawn breaks while he's still in the street, he risks being seen, and being seen means being ridiculed. Or worse, reported. Some neighborhoods considered night soilmen a public nuisance, and banned them from operating near respectable homes. Because heaven forbid your morning baguette should be interrupted by the scent of your own digestive legacy being carted away. Let's not forget the health risks. Toxic gases, skin infections, respiratory illness. One wrong breath in a sealed pit could knock you unconscious or dead. More than one worker died from collapsing cesspit walls or drowning in the very thing they were hired to remove. And yet, somehow, there was no hazard pay. In fact, there was barely any pay. A good night might bring in enough for a hot meal and some soap. A bad night? You ended up with a bruised rib, a broken wheel, and someone shouting that you'd tracked something unspeakable through their front garden. So, let's summarize the position. Night soil man? Now hiring? Duties include descending into unsanitary underground pits, removing several 100 pounds of fermenting human waste by hand, hauling it across town without vomiting, and doing so with discretion, speed, and zero gratitude. Must be willing to risk injury, disease, public humiliation, and permanent olfactory damage. Pay, inconsistent. Uniform, none. Retirement plan, a shallow grave outside the city walls. Sounds appealing, right? And yet, men took the job, again and again. Not because they loved it, but because someone had to do it. Because as long as humans keep eating, they keep producing consequences. And every society needs someone to deal with those consequences, quietly, thanklessly, in the middle of the night. You might be thinking, well, this sounds like the worst gig in history. And you wouldn't be wrong. But we're only getting started. Because while the job itself was nightmare fuel, the tools they used, well, let's just say OSHA would have a stroke. Next up, we're diving into the actual equipment of the trade. And trust me, you're going to want to wash your hands just hearing about it. Let's take a moment to appreciate how far we've come as a species. Today, if your toilet backs up, you can call a plumber, who arrives in a van that says Sanitec Solutions, or something equally sterile, wearing rubber gloves, boot covers, and the look of a man paid just enough to fake optimism. But back in 18th century Paris, if your cesspit overflowed, the cavalry showed up with a bucket, a shovel, and a prayer. Let's begin with the bucket, shall we? This was not your tidy little hardware store pail. No ergonomic handles, no splash guard. Just a heavy, splinter-riddled wooden bucket, sometimes banded with rusting iron, and almost always stained with things we shall not name. Buckets came in different sizes depending on the cesspit. Bigger meant fewer trips, smaller meant fewer spinal injuries. Choose your poison. Now, the real fun started when you had to lower the bucket into the pit. Enter the hook, usually an iron claw, bent crudely by the village blacksmith, or possibly just repurposed from something that used to hang meat. The hook would be tied to a rope, then gingerly used to fish out the thicker, clotted material that refused to come quietly. Think of it like bobbing for apples, if the apples were decades of fecal matter and the water was misery. Then came the shovel, a long-handled beast, blunt and battered, more weapon than tool. You didn't dig with it so much as scrape, pry, and hack your way through a crust that had the consistency of wet cardboard and the temperament of a feral badger. Night soil men quickly developed a rhythm, one that involved stabbing into the pit, twisting, lifting and flinging, all without letting the splashback hit their face. It was an art, a disgusting, underrated art. And let's not forget the rake. Yes, there was a rake. Not the kind you'd use on autumn leaves, unless you hate your garden. This one had iron teeth, bent at angles that suggested either design failure or deliberate cruelty. It was used to agitate the surface of the pit, to stir up the layers like some hellish compost, or to loosen the edges before shoveling. Occasionally it was also used to rescue a fallen tool, or, once, a co-worker. Then of course came the lantern. A dim, flickering flame enclosed in a thin glass globe, dangling from a hook or nailed to the cart. It wasn't there for mood lighting, it was there because total darkness, bottomless pit, their accidental burial. The trouble was, these lanterns didn't give off much light. They were more symbolic than practical, like giving someone a band-aid for a sword wound. Naturally, fire and methane gas made for a charming combination. Methane, as it turns out, is flammable, and cesspits were methane gold mines. So every time a night soil man lowered his lantern into the pit, he played a little game of will this be the night my eyebrows vanish? And while we're discussing equipment, we must address the elephant in the room. Or rather the complete lack of protective clothing. There were no masks, no rubber gloves, no hazmat suits. What did they wear? Usually whatever they could afford not to cry over. Heavy wool trousers, aprons made from old sacks, coats stained beyond recognition, and boots, if they were lucky. If not, wooden clogs or bare feet. Yes, bare feet, because sometimes you didn't own boots and you still had to eat. There was no standard uniform, but there was a dress code. Namely, wear something you're prepared to burn afterward. Many workers had a dedicated set of night clothes, not the cozy kind with buttons and flannel, but rags so foul they were banned from being washed in public fountains. Some men covered their faces with scarves soaked in vinegar, believing it would neutralize the smell. It did, but it gave the illusion of trying. Now, after a long night of scooping, lifting and gagging, you needed a way to transport your haul. Enter the night cart, a wooden wheelbarrow or two-wheeled cart, depending on budget and muscle. These weren't engineered marvels. They wobbled, they squeaked, they tilted at the worst possible moments. Most leaked. Some had lids, which were a joke. Others were open air, because if you're already dragging 200 pounds of waste through the streets, what's a little extra atmosphere? Some carts were pulled by hand. Others by mule. Occasionally a small, bitter man named Henry. And if you think the streets of Paris were smooth and evenly paved, allow me to introduce you to the historical concept of cobblestones. Nothing like watching a full load of human waste tip sideways after hitting a loose stone. Just imagine the splash radius. Night soil men became intimately familiar with their tools. Not because they loved them, but because their lives depended on them. A cracked bucket meant more trips. A dull shovel meant more strain. A broken lantern meant total darkness inside a pit of despair. Tools weren't just objects, they were lifelines. And yet, most were bought second-hand, or made, or borrowed permanently from other crews, who would then retaliate by urinating on your ladder. Oh, and speaking of ladders, they deserve their own paragraph. These weren't OSHA-approved fiberglass beauties. These were hand-carved rickety monstrosities that swayed like carnival rides. The rungs were uneven, the frames cracked, and the bottom, usually submerged in something unspeakable. Every step down was a gamble, every step up was a victory. Now, pause for a second, picture yourself, dressed in tattered wool, holding a shovel that smells like betrayal, squinting through a smudged lantern, standing ankle-deep in excrement. And yet, you press on, because this is your job. Your tools are crude, your surroundings are revolting, and your pay is laughable. But the work keeps the city running. Literally. And the craziest part, no one ever said thank you. Next time, we'll enter the strange symphony of the Parisian night, where whispers, drips, and squelches form the background music of civilization's dirtiest job. At night, Paris exhaled. The boulevards fell silent. The shutters clicked shut like eyelids closing over long-suffering eyes. The rich retreated to their feather beds. The poor curled beside empty hearths. And the city bloated with people, secrets and indigestion tried its best to sleep. But not everyone got to rest. Because if you listened carefully, past the lullabies, past the rustle of skirts and straw mattresses, you could hear it. The midnight symphony of a city quietly unraveling itself. It began with a creak, not sinister, not loud, just the unmistakable groan of a warped cellar door, pushed open by a man whose boots had never been truly dry. Then came the faint metallic rattle of tools, shovel, rake, bucket, always the bucket, a slow, resigned clatter, like bones in a bag. From there the soundtrack deepened, a muffled grunt, A splash that didn't sound like water. The slow grind of a cartwheel over cobblestones, protesting every bump with a tortured squeal. The clink of lantern glass, tapping iron, and if you listened long enough, you'd catch it. The wet, sucking squelch of a man ankle-deep in last month's regrets, trying to dislodge his foot without losing his soul. This was the nightly rhythm of the night soil men, the unsung percussionists in Paris's grand composition. While nobles dreamt and bakers dozed, these men set to work beneath the city's consciousness, moving through alleys and under windows with the patience of ghosts and the aroma of doom. Some nights the city seemed to cooperate. A gentle fog would roll in, muffling footsteps and muting shame. The moon might hide behind a cloud, giving workers the dignity of darkness. The wind would carry the smell somewhere else, preferably toward Versailles. Other nights were less kind. The air would hang, stagnant and thick, clinging to nostrils like honey-soaked gauze. A sudden cough would echo too loud. A dog would bark and wake the entire street. Someone would fling open a shutter and curse the stench, never wondering who was actually down there, hauling their sins into the moonlight. And yet, for the men in the muck, the soundscape was familiar, almost comforting in its predictability. There was the drip, a near-constant plink of water, or something that had once been water, falling from the ceilings of ancient cesspits. It created a metronome, a steady, mocking reminder that the job was far from done. There was the swish thunk. That was the shovel hitting the bottom, striking stone beneath sludge, then slinging it upward in a graceful arc of brown inevitability. There was the gurgle, occasionally from the pits, occasionally from the worker. No judgment either way. And sometimes there was the scream. Not a dramatic, cinematic shriek, more of a startled yelp, when something alive moved unexpectedly. Rats, mostly, but sometimes other things. Night soil men learned quickly not to question every ripple in the waste. Now and then, a voice would cut through the night, soft, almost apologetic. Désolé. That was a tenant, catching a glimpse of the man beneath the house. A wordless thank you disguised as guilt. Rare, fleeting, but appreciated. Further up the street, another sound would join the mix. The splash of chamber pots being emptied from windows above. The call of garde à l'eau, barely a whisper, if offered at all. And below, the silent prayer of a man hoping he wasn't in the splash zone. Let that sink in. You're waist deep in the city's digestive aftermath. Exhausted, sore, wondering if you still have toes, and someone just dumps tomorrow's edition directly on your head, without so much as a warning. The night soil men learn to work fast, not just to beat sunrise, but to avoid these little accidents. You moved quickly, quietly. You knew which houses to avoid, which alleys had loose bricks, which cesspits belched and which hissed. You listened, constantly, because the sounds weren't just background noise, they were signals, warnings, rhythms. They told you when something was wrong, when the pit was too quiet, when the ladder creaked the wrong way, when the cartwheel made a noise you didn't like. You learned to hear the job before you saw it, and in between the work, in those brief, stolen moments of pause, you heard something else. The city breathed. Not the sanitized Paris of postcards and paintings, but the real one, the Paris of sweat and sorrow, the Paris that hummed with the quiet endurance of millions just trying to make it to morning. A baby cried behind a closed door. A man coughed violently in a courtyard, the kind of cough that lingered and foreshadowed. A woman wept softly into her apron, sitting beside a chamber pot she couldn't afford to have emptied. And through it all, the night soil men kept moving. Not because they were brave, not because they enjoyed it, but because it was their job. And jobs in that city were hard to come by, especially ones people actively avoided. There was no music on these nights, no violin drifting from balconies, no songs of joy, just the dull, methodical ballet of a city removing its filth, bucket by bucket, sigh by sigh. Still, there was rhythm, a kind of poetry, dark, damp, foul, but poetry nonetheless. And if you're quiet, really quiet, you can still hear it. The ghosts of shovels, scraping stone, the whisper of boots in gutter water, the final clunk of a cartwheel turning one last corner before the sun comes up. In the next chapter, we'll shift gears from soundscape to economy, because as it turns out, poop had a price, and everyone wanted their share. Let's talk business. Not show business. Not small business. Sewage business. Because, in 18th century Paris, even poop had a price tag. A literal economy was built on the back of human waste, scraped, scooped, and sloshed from the bowels of the city into the arms of people who saw profit in what everyone else pretended didn't exist. Now, you might assume that night soil was just disposed of, hauled off into the countryside, buried in a shallow ditch, and forgotten like a bad date. But no. Oh no. This was valuable stuff. At least to people who knew what to do with it, which frankly says a lot about the economy back then. Let's start at the top of this pungent pyramid scheme. The Parisian farmers. These clever souls figured out that human waste, particularly the rich, fermented kind scraped fresh from urban cesspits, made excellent fertilizer. It was free, abundant, and best of all, packed with nutrients. Nothing said bumper crop, like aristocratic leftovers. The trick, of course, was getting the product from city to field. And that's where the night soil men evolved from humble waste removers to freelance biodistribution specialists. Some cut deals with local growers, a few started side hustles, delivering to multiple farms and haggling over rates like shady traders at a sewer-based stock exchange. But not all poop was created equal. Fresh waste was considered too wet, too volatile, and let's be honest, too alive. The good stuff? That came from aged cesspits. Thick, dense, aged like a fine cheese no one ever wants to smell. This vintage muck fetched higher prices. The night soil men who knew how to age and store it properly, they became the poop sommeliers of their time. Naturally, with value came theft. Oh yes, waste theft was real. Rival crews would poach each other's collections, sneak into assigned cesspits, and siphon off buckets to resell elsewhere. Entire cartloads went missing. There were even rumors of gangs who hijacked night soil routes, demanded cuts of the profit, and enforced turf boundaries with surprisingly aggressive shovels. This wasn't just about survival anymore. It was a full-blown black market of brown gold, and the city, well, it tried to regulate things. Officials issued permits, drafted ordinances, proposed standardized dump zones. But it was like trying to herd drunk cats through an open sewer, chaotic, slippery, and guaranteed to end in disappointment. Enforcement was lax, corruption was rampant, and night soil men knew it. Some greased palms to get better routes. Others paid guards to ignore their unauthorized dumping spots. And then there were the creative entrepreneurs, the ones who cut their product with ash or sawdust to increase volume and pocket more coins. Yes, poop was being diluted. That's how high the stakes were. Then there were the graveyards. Oh yes, human waste often ended up being dumped near or directly on top of mass graves. Because, hey, who's going to complain? These spots were outside city limits, out of sight, and conveniently located near fields that could benefit from a little organic enhancement. That's how your lettuce got its crunch, folk. And let's not forget the barrelmen, a whole side branch of the sanitation economy. They didn't just haul waste, they rented out barrels to collect it, rent a barrel, fill it, pay extra if it overflowed. Some landlords forced tenants to share a barrel. Others tried to monopolize the system by owning the only barrels in an entire arrondissement. It was like Amazon, but smellier and more openly corrupt. You might be wondering, how much could someone actually make selling crap? Not a fortune, but enough. Enough to buy food. Occasionally enough to afford rent. Sometimes enough to bribe the neighbor to stop complaining about the smell. For the poorest Parisians, this disgusting, degrading trade was more reliable than begging or weaving lace. The irony. Many of the same people who profited from human waste were the ones who shunned the men collecting it. Farmers thanked the muck, not the muck hauler. Landlords pocketed their share while refusing to let soil men enter through the front. City officials taxed the waste, but never cleaned it up themselves. Let that irony marinate for a second. You're good enough to fertilize their crops, good enough to fuel their side hustle, but not good enough to drink from their well or walk their streets without someone holding a scented handkerchief and making gagging noises. And yet, the system worked. In its grim, squishy, exploitative way, it worked. The streets were cleaned eventually, the fields were fed, and a whole hidden class of workers made just enough to keep crawling through the cracks of society. This was the economy beneath the economy, the unspoken network, the invisible scaffolding, holding up the illusion of refinement and civilization. And at the center of it all, a guy named maybe Louis or Etienne or Claude, hauling a splintered bucket, covered in filth, whispering a deal to a farmer before vanishing down an alley no one else would dare walk. So yes, poop had value. And so did the people who moved it. In the next chapter, we'll descend into the darker side of this trade, the turf wars, the sabotage, the jealous rage over who got to clean which pit. Because if you think hauling waste was dangerous, wait until you see what happened when someone tried to steal a rival's shovel. Competition is supposed to breed excellence. In most professions, it leads to better products, better service, or at least a slightly faster delivery window. But when your product is fermented human waste, and your job involves nightly spelunking into the city's digestive tract, competition doesn't lead to innovation, it leads to fecal warfare. Welcome to the rivalries of the rakers, the unspoken turf battles waged in the shadows of Enlightenment Paris by men wielding shovels like swords and buckets like blunt instruments of economic dominance. See, by the late 1700s, the night soil trade wasn't just a miserable job. It was a system with roots, clients, and territory. Each crew had their own slice of Paris, usually informal, but fiercely defended. And while there were no maps, no written agreements, every man knew where he belonged, and more importantly where he didn't. The rules were simple: don't poach someone else's cesspits, don't undercut prices, and never steal a client. These were sacred guidelines in an otherwise lawless profession. But rules, as always, invited breaking. It started small. A raker named Pascal dumps a load 2 blocks outside his usual zone. Just a shortcut, he says. But Jacques, whose zone it was, takes it personally. The next night, Pascal's cart has a mysteriously shattered wheel. Jacques swears it wasn't him, but he's also whistling and eating stew out of a bowl, with no cutlery, which is suspiciously casual for a man with no working cart. From there things escalated. Cesspits got raided. Barrels were emptied before pickup. Tools went missing. One man returned to his regular pit to find sand had been poured over the top. A petty act of sabotage requiring planning, effort, and a deeply specific kind of pettiness. The rivalries weren't just individual either. They became crew-based. Some rakers formed loose alliances, operating in teams, watching each other's backs. Others went solo, lone wolves in the night, trying to outmaneuver the packs. Fights broke out. Tools turned into weapons, and in one case, a full-on brawl erupted in the middle of Rue Saint-Denis over who had the rights to a newly vacated tenement's pit. The police were, understandably, uninterested. After all, these were not respectable citizens. 2 night soil men beating each other senseless with rakes wasn't a public concern, unless it blocked traffic. Then, and only then, would a guard arrive to shout vague threats and walk away before the smell soaked into his uniform. Still, the conflicts weren't always physical. There was espionage, too. Crews would send boys to spy on rivals, noting schedules, routes, and which pits were close to overflowing, ripe for poaching. Some men dressed differently on alternate nights to disguise their identities. One legendary raker allegedly worked under 3 different names, collecting triple pay across overlapping zones. He vanished mysteriously. Most assume he fled. Others say he was disappeared by competitors, and is now fertilizing a field outside Montreal. And then there was Emile. A man so territorial he once stood guard over a cesspit for 3 straight nights to ensure no one touched it. People thought he was mad. He thought he was dedicated. He also lost 3 toes to trench foot. Make of that what you will. The tension wasn't just about pride. It was about survival. These routes paid just enough to keep a man fed. Losing a regular cesspit meant losing income. Sometimes the only income, and when you're already living on crusts and vinegar, losing a bucket's worth of earnings could mean sleeping hungry or worse, being replaced by someone younger, stronger, and slightly less infected. It created a hierarchy too. The best routes, wealthier homes, predictable output, minimal splash zones were highly coveted. Newcomers started with the dregs, abandoned buildings, poorly dug pits, places where the stench had personality, and the methane could knock a mule unconscious. Advancing in this world meant stepping over your peers, sometimes literally. This was no rags to riches tale. No one got rich, but a few got stable. A few owned their own carts. A few negotiated exclusive dumping deals with farmers, and once you had a foothold, you protected it. Which leads us to the story of the man they called No-Nose Pierre. Pierre was a veteran raker, tough, efficient, and reportedly able to identify pit contents by scent alone. He had a monopoly on a stretch of Saint-Antoine, but when a new crew moved in, younger men from the southern districts, they tried to take one of his regular tenements. Pierre warned them, once. The next night their cart was found upside down in a gutter, and Pierre was walking with a new limp and a very smug expression. 2 nights later, Pierre disappeared. Some say he left town. Others claimed he was seen in the pit, behind the butcher's hall, not alive, and not entirely intact. His shovel was found weeks later, split in 2. The mystery was never solved. But from then on, that particular tenement was left untouched, out of fear or respect. So yes, hauling human waste came with turf wars. These men fought for their right to scrape filth from the city's underbelly, because the alternative was hunger, homelessness, or worse, irrelevance. And in a city where the rich dined in salons while the poor drowned in sludge, relevance was everything. Next up, we'll take a tour of the worst cesspits Paris had to offer. The absolute bottom of the barrel. The ones so infamous they made grown men weep, even before the ladder cracked beneath their feet. There are bad places to work. And then there are privies in pre-revolutionary Paris. We're talking about the crown jewels of olfactory terrorism, the cesspits that made night soil men reconsider their life choices, their gods, and the choices of everyone who lived upstairs. These weren't just latrines. These were acts of architectural cruelty. Let's begin with the House of Dubois, located in the Marais. From the street, it looked like any other aristocratic townhouse. Ivy-covered facade, delicate iron balconies, maybe a bored servant polishing the door knocker with existential dread. But in the basement, a cesspit that hadn't been emptied in 17 years. No exaggeration. The walls were crusted with strata that looked like geological formations. If you squinted, you could almost date each layer. Revolutionary France, now with more sediment. When the night soil team arrived, after 3 separate crews turned it down, they opened the hatch and immediately gagged. One man swore he saw something moving in there. Something big, with eyes. They called it Le Monstre. They never confirmed what it was, but they also never went back without backup and a torch. Then there was Madame Tissot's boarding house, over in the Latin Quarter. You'd think students and professors might be relatively clean. You'd be wrong. Her tenants, mostly young men with strong opinions and no money, seemed to treat the privy as a challenge, not a convenience. By the time the pit was serviced, it was so full, the waste had begun seeping upward into the woodwork. Guests reportedly found soft spots in the floor that were not due to termites. The shovel actually got stuck. That's right, they couldn't dislodge it. The excrement had formed what can only be described as a semi-sentient crust, and one raker lost both his tool and his temper trying to extract it. The pit was eventually cleared with a pickaxe. Yes, a pickaxe. It took 4 nights, 2 carts, and a priest who blessed the operation just in case. But perhaps the most notorious of all was the latrine behind the Royal Printworks. It served over 200 workers, most of them men who lived on ale, bread, and bitterness. The pit was technically illegal. It wasn't up to code, which in Paris meant dug by someone who had once seen a spade. It had no lining, no drainage, and was located directly beneath the stairwell. Imagine descending into work every morning with a soft squelch and an aggressive sense of mortality. When the pit finally collapsed, yes, collapsed, a worker's leg broke through the floor and into the filth. They pulled him out, hosed him down, gave him a day off, and then reboarded the hole. The night soil crew tasked with fixing it refused to work, unless paid triple. One man fainted before reaching the bottom, another quit on the spot, walked away barefoot, and was never seen again. Let's not forget the public latrines, either. The so-called conveniences scattered across the city like little monuments to shared suffering. These were open-air, unventilated, and often used by dozens, sometimes hundreds of people per day. There were no attendants, no cleanings, just walls streaked with shame and floor puddles of dubious origin. If the night soil men were lucky, they'd hit one on a quiet night. If they were unlucky, it was after a festival. One particularly cursed latrine near Place Maubert was known simply as La Bouche. No one knew why. Some said it was because the opening looked like a mouth. Others claimed it made noises, gurgling, moaning, sometimes even hissing. A night soil man named Benoit swore it whispered his name. Benoit retired 2 weeks later, No one argued. There were also cesspits in religious institutions, which might surprise you until you remember that monks are still people. Quiet, contemplative, vegetarian people who use the facilities just like everyone else. And let me tell you, some of those abbey privies were vats of despair, decades of solemn digestion trapped in cellars designed more for prayer than plumbing. One pit beneath a convent had tree roots growing into it. Actual roots. Feeding off the decay, the shovel would hit them mid-scoop, snapping off chunks of vine, so pungent they made the lantern flicker. One man claimed the roots were warm. That same man got into gardening and refused to speak of his time in the pit again. But the worst, the absolute worst, that would be the cesspit beneath the old theatre on Rue Beaubourg. It wasn't just the volume, though that was considerable, given the full houses and strong pre-show wine. It was the slope. Someone, in their infinite architectural wisdom, had constructed the privy on an incline, meaning waste didn't settle, it trickled downhill. The pit never filled. It just migrated. Slowly, evilly. It leaked into the foundations, into the hallways, into the orchestra pit. One unlucky violinist slipped during a rehearsal, and never played again. When the crew finally came to service it, they didn't even try to go in. They burned the floorboards, shored up the walls, and wrote in their logbook, "This place is cursed, never return." So yes, not all privies were created equal. Some were bad, some were unforgivable, and some reached a level of foul that bordered on the supernatural. Next, we'll meet a man who fell into one of these very cesspits and lived to tell the tale, or rather to wheeze it through the one nostril that still functioned. His name was Jean Leclerc. Not a noble, not a philosopher, just a man with a shovel, a limp, and a face that permanently smelled of boiled socks. If history were fair, Jean would be on a postage stamp. Instead, he's a ghost. One of countless night soil men, swallowed and forgotten by the very city they cleaned. But Jean earned his place in this story, because he did what few others managed to do. He fell into a cesspit, and survived. It happened one foggy October evening, behind a bakery near Les Halles, the kind of bakery that smelled heavenly up top, and hellish below. Jean had been working the same pit for years. A regular assignment, nothing fancy, but steady. He knew the angles, knew the feel of the ladder underfoot, knew which spots in the muck were solid enough to stand on, and which ones gurgled back at you. But this night, something was off. The bakery had recently expanded, knocking down an interior wall, and in the process, someone, probably the baker's nephew, who had all the intelligence of a loaf of underbaked rye, had tampered with the pit structure. They'd propped a wooden beam across the edge, right where the ladder met the hatch. It looked sturdy enough. It was. Jean descended, as usual. One rung, two. Then, snap. The beam gave way. The ladder pitched, and Jean plunged straight into 6 feet of historical regret. He went under fast. Boots, bucket, lantern, and dignity all vanishing in a single, horrifying glop. For 30 seconds he disappeared. The man working above screamed. Someone ran for help. Another worker vomited. A few prayed. But Jill was down there, in the blackness, lungs burning, eyes stinging, searching for us, and somehow, impossibly, he found it. He surfaced like a breaching whale, gasping, slick with a substance that defied taxonomy. His shovel was gone, his lantern shattered, but he was alive, coughing, sputtering, blinded, and very much alive. They dragged him out with a rope, washed him with rainwater and vinegar. One man offered him a drink. Jean took it, downed it, and said nothing for a full hour. Then, with a voice like sandpaper soaked in bourbon, he muttered, "Well, that pit's deeper than I thought." From that day on, Jean was a legend. Not a hero. There were no medals for surviving a vat of human waste. But among his peers, he was respected. They called him Le Survivant, the survivor, and also Nesmiot, the mute nose, because after the fall, he lost most of his sense of smell, and conveniently, a fair portion of his hearing. He returned to work the very next week. Why? Because he had a wife, 2 sons, a cat named Marcel, and bills, always bills. No one paid your rent just because you nearly drowned in digestive history. So Jean picked up another shovel, lit another lantern, and went back into the pits, albeit with a new policy of tapping the ladder 3 times before descending. He worked slower after that, more cautiously. and he never went in alone again. But he still worked, through rain, frost, injuries, and illness. His skin grew rough, his hands calloused beyond recognition. His beard perpetually smelled like damp canvas, but he kept showing up because someone had to, and not just for money. Jean carried a kind of quiet pride, the kind that doesn't announce itself, but hums beneath the surface. He believed the city owed its cleanliness, its order, its very survival, to men like him. He never said it out loud. He didn't need to. It was in the way he gripped his tools, the way he folded his coat, the way he didn't flinch when stepping into the dark. Of course, life didn't reward Jean for this nobility. His wife died young, cholera, an irony so cruel even he didn't joke about it. His sons moved away. One joined the navy. The other opened a tannery. Neither wrote much. By the time he turned 50, Jean's back had begun to curve. His knees ached in the cold, but he was still working, still hauling, still the man who had emerged from the pit. He passed away quietly, during an unusually warm spring, sitting on the edge of a cart beside a half-loaded barrel. They say he looked peaceful, one hand resting on his knee, the other curled around the handle of his old, cracked shovel, as if he'd simply paused for breath and decided not to start again. No monument marks where he fell. No plaque honors his service. But among the few remaining night soil men, his name became something more than a memory. It became a story. And sometimes, that's all a man can hope for. Next, we'll explore the hidden rituals and unwritten rules of Jean's world. The secret code of the Night Soil Brotherhood, where survival depended not just on strength, but on silence, strategy, and never ever mixing the wrong buckets. There was no uniform, no badge, no handshake that unlocked secret meetings in candlelit basements. But make no mistake, the Night Soil men of Paris had a code, a silent, stubborn, splinter-covered code, passed from calloused hand to calloused hand, whispered between gulps of sour wine and the occasional dry heave. Because, when your job is crawling into cesspits and dragging civilization's sins back out, etiquette becomes survival. Let's start with the first rule. As sacred as anything written in blood or ink, don't ask questions. Where does the waste go after it's dumped? How old is this pit? What's that floating thing with the shoe attached? These are not questions to be asked. Curiosity, in this line of work, wasn't just dangerous. It was a liability. It could slow you down, distract you, make you think, and thinking in a place that smells like history's armpit is not advised. Rule 2. Don't work drunk. Now this one was more strong suggestion than gospel. Many broke it, but those who didn't, the veterans, swore by it, because alcohol makes you sloppy, and sloppy leads to dropped buckets, misjudged ladders, or worse, falling in and making headlines as a cautionary tale. No one wanted to go out like old Martin the Soaked. Then there was the bucket rule, possibly the most important. Never confuse the fresh and the fermented. Night soil wasn't just waste, it was aged. There were layers, there were textures, there was a system. The top was loose, wet and highly volatile. The bottom, thick, chunky, and dangerously dense. Each required a different shovel, a different technique, and crucially, a different bucket. Woe to the man who mixed them. The stench, ungodly. The consequences, social exile, even among men who routinely swam through liquefied embarrassment. There was also the first in, last out principle, not just about ladders, but trust. The man who descended first into the pit was the lead for the job. He set the pace. He chose the dumping site. If someone had to stay behind to finish a partial load, it was him. It was a rank system without titles. You earned your place by crawling through enough muck without dying or crying, ideally both. But perhaps the most sacred part of the code wasn't spoken at all. It was how you treated the dead. Every few years, someone didn't come back up. Sometimes the wall collapsed. Sometimes the gases overwhelmed them. Sometimes it was just bad luck. A crack in the floor, a misstep, a rope that snapped under strain. When that happened, the pit was sealed. Not drained, not investigated, just sealed. A crude cross might be carved into the wood. The names, if remembered, were passed down like warnings. That one ate Pierre. This one belonged to Arnaud. It was understood. The city kept its own. Among the living, the code governed tools too. You never borrowed without asking. You never cleaned someone's shovel. It was seen as an insult, like telling a man his hands weren't dirty enough. Buckets were personal. Lanterns too. Carts could be shared, but only if both parties agreed to scrub them after. And scrub they did, with vinegar, ash and a kind of spite that bordered on religious. There were taboos, of course. Superstitions that bordered on rituals. Whistling near a full pit was considered bad luck. Swearing in a church cesspit, double bad. Dropping your shovel and letting it clang. That meant someone would fall within the week. Did it make sense? No. But when your life involved dodging both disease and gravity, you took your omens seriously. And then there were the nicknames. No one went by their birth name once they'd been in the trade a few years. You earned a new one, usually based on something you'd rather forget. There was Three-Finger Jean, Soggy Etienne, the Croaker, and perhaps most famously, Pot Whisperer, a man who claimed he could hear when a pit was ready to be drained. No one believed him. Everyone let him have his moment. But behind all the grime, the rules, the black humor, was something else. A code of dignity. You didn't shame your fellow man. You didn't mock the cries of a first-timer. You didn't laugh when someone slipped. Not unless they laughed first. And if someone lost their nerve, you helped them out. Quietly. Without comment. Because tomorrow it could be you. Still watching? Then you know what to do. Like, subscribe, and raise a metaphorical shovel for Jean and every man who lived by a code no one else bothered to write down. Because when the job is this bad, the only thing holding you together is the unspoken promise that no one gets left behind. Not in the pit. Not in the stories. Not in the smell that clings to your boots long after the last load has been dumped. In the next chapter we'll look at how society viewed these men, and how, in a twist of foul irony, they were blamed for the very filth they removed. It's easy to look back and chuckle at how clueless people were in the past. Bloodletting, mercury tonics, leech therapy. But when it came to sanitation in 18th century Paris, the medical community didn't just miss the mark, they dug a latrine in the wrong field. Let's begin with the science, or rather, the lack of it. Back then, disease wasn't caused by germs, because germs hadn't been invented yet, or, more accurately, they hadn't been discovered. Instead, the dominant theory was miasma, the idea that foul smells carried disease. Not bacteria, not viruses. Just odor. Smell something nasty? Congratulations, you're probably dying. Doctors of the time were trained in Latin, astrology, and how to wear really intimidating wigs. They weren't trained to understand bacteria, water contamination, or the connection between poop and cholera. So naturally, when people got sick, they blamed the night soil men. Yes, the very individuals who were removing the waste were seen as the source of infection. The logic? They smelled bad, and bad smells, disease. It didn't matter that these men were actively preventing cesspits from overflowing into people's kitchens. They were still accused of spreading the rot. Let that sink in. You spend your nights elbow deep in human refuse, hauling away literal disease vectors, and society turns around and says, wow, you really stink. You must be the reason I'm coughing up blood. It's like blaming firefighters for the smoke. The hypocrisy was rank. Wealthy households hired night soil men discreetly, often through intermediaries, then banned them from entering through the front door. Some nobles even issued instructions. Please collect the waste, but do not be seen. The Enlightenment was big on reason, but apparently not on basic decency. And don't get too excited about government regulation either. The city of Paris had sanitation laws, some of which dated back centuries, but enforcement was as solid as a wet croissant. There were rules against dumping waste in the streets, against overfilling cesspits, even against using certain types of containers. But unless a noble complained directly to the police, nothing happened, and the police were busy with more glamorous crimes, like bread theft and subversive pamphlet distribution. In the rare instance when sanitation inspections did occur, the blame never fell on landlords or city officials. It fell squarely on the night soil men, accused of negligence, laziness, or failure to deodorize the literal mountains of other people's digestive disasters. One report from 1782 described a night soil crew as public nuisances who carry filth and disease on their persons. Their crime? Failing to cover their carts while transporting 300 pounds of aging effluents through a crowded street. Was there a cover available? No. Was there a design for such a cover? Also no. Did they get fined anyway? Of course they did. This created a grim paradox. The worse the health crisis got, the more people blamed the very workers trying to fix it. During outbreaks of dysentery or summer fevers, usually caused by contaminated water, mobs formed outside the homes of known night soil men. One man, Benoit Duclos, had his windows smashed. Another was chased down an alley by a crowd wielding chamber pots like weapons. Because nothing says I understand disease transmission like throwing poop at the sanitation worker. And still, these men showed up. They showed up when the pit was bubbling. They showed up when the walls were crumbling. They showed up when the streets were slick with more than rain. Because even if society saw them as disease incarnate, they understood something fundamental. Without them, people would die. Literally, not in a poetic heroes among us kind of way. In a very real, very gruesome way, involving open wounds, dirty water, and a slow spiral into fever and dehydration. The connection between clean environments and health may not have been understood in academic circles yet, but the night soil men knew it firsthand. They saw what happened when a pit went ignored. They smelled the consequence, and sometimes they paid the price themselves. Skin infections, lung problems, cuts that refused to heal. One unlucky fellow caught tetanus after a nail sliced through his boot mid-shovel. He locked up within days. No doctor would treat him too filthy, they said. He died on a cot, alone, surrounded by tools no one else dared touch. And yet society persisted in treating them as plague carriers, not plague preventers. That's the thing about visibility. The night soil men weren't supposed to be seen, and when they were, people wished they hadn't been. They were tolerated only as long as they remained shadows, silent, compliant, invisible. But invisibility doesn't protect you from blame. In fact, it makes you the easiest target. Can't blame the nobles, they have influence. Can't blame the city, that's abstract. But the man with the shovel and the smell, he's right there, and he's expendable. There's something bitterly modern in that logic. The more things change, the more they ferment. Next we'll shift focus from the men hauling the waste to the people living among it. The chambermaids, laundresses, and wet nurses caught between the stink and the silence. If you think the night soil men had it bad, and let's be honest, they absolutely did. Consider the people who didn't even get the dignity of a shovel, the ones who lived beside the cesspits, who cleaned the pots, who breathed the fumes every day, and still had to smile through it. Welcome to the other side of the bucket. Let's start with chambermaids. These women were the unsung, underpaid workforce of Parisian households, particularly in the homes of the elite, where aristocrats didn't just expect their chamber pots emptied, they expected it done silently, immediately, and without leaving so much as a whiff in the air. Chambermaids were responsible for collecting, carrying, and disposing of the household waste, and yes, they had to do it in full dress, sometimes while serving breakfast with the same hands. The tools of the trade: a rag, a bucket, maybe if they were lucky, a cloth dipped in rose water to wave in front of their faces. No gloves, no masks, just bare hands and practiced breathing techniques. In some houses, they had to carry the pots down multiple flights of stairs, dump the contents into a shared pit, and then return without staining the carpet or knocking over a vase. A single mistake could cost them their job, or worse, their reputation. Now, consider laundresses. Paris had plenty of them. Strong-backed, iron-willed women who scrubbed the linens of the wealthy in freezing river water, rain or shine. The trick: many of those linens were soiled, not just with food or sweat, but with, let's call it organic history, especially from children. Diapers weren't exactly high-tech back then, and most babies wore reusable cloth swaddling that had to be washed by hand, often after marinating in a corner for a few days. The laundresses worked near the Seine, dipping cloth into water already tainted by upstream waste. It was common knowledge that you avoided drinking river water in certain districts, but you could still scrub sheets in it. If your hands bled from the cold, too bad. If you passed out from the stench, someone else took your spot. There were no unions, only rivers, rags, and quiet resentment. And then there were the wet nurses. These women breastfed other people's children for a living, often while raising their own. They lived in the same homes as the families they served, usually in cramped quarters near the kitchens or servants' entrances. And because they were considered low status, guess where their chambers were typically placed? Right next to the cesspits. Because who needs ventilation when you're just feeding an infant, right? Some wet nurses fell ill from the fumes. Others lost their own children to disease, while nursing the offspring of nobles in silk cribs. And when they complained, they were told to be grateful for a roof over their heads. The class divide in Paris wasn't just economic, it was architectural. The poorest lived closest to the waste. Basement rooms, windowless corners, and attic spaces, with chamber pots shared by 20 people. These weren't homes, they were holding cells, and for the women who lived in them, every day involved navigating someone else's filth, both figuratively and literally. It wasn't just the adults who suffered. Children too were part of this ecosystem. They cleaned floors, emptied small pots, fetched water from wells located dangerously close to open sewage drains. Some boys followed night soil carts, hoping for coins or bread crusts tossed by drivers. Others stole tools. One child reportedly drowned in a barrel of waste after trying to fish out a wooden toy he'd dropped. And yet, life continued. Because what choice did they have? There were no sanitation campaigns, no pamphlets explaining germ theory, no scented candles strong enough to erase the odor of shared survival. Just hard work, heavy air, and the unspoken understanding that you had to keep going, or you'd be replaced. And despite all this, society still managed to blame these women. If a child got sick, the laundress brought it in. If a noble's room began to smell, the chambermaid didn't scrub hard enough. If disease crept through the walls, the servants are dirty. It never occurred to anyone that the entire system was built to rot, and that these women were simply trying to survive within it. Let's pause for a moment and reflect. What happens when your home is built next to a cesspit you're not allowed to clean? When you're forced to live within reach of the disease, but banned from the tools to remove it? What happens is simple. You endure, because that's what women did, in silence, in stink, and in service to people who never learned their names, but they remembered each other. They passed hips, shared scraps, looked after each other's children, laughed when they could, wept when they had to, and somehow, impossibly made life work amid the rot. Next we'll zoom out again from kitchens and cradles to the salons of the Enlightenment, because while the philosophers talked liberty, fraternity, and powdered wigs, the waste just kept rising. Picture it, Paris, 1780. The candles are lit, the salons are packed, silk rustles, powdered wigs tilt at elegant angles, and the air crackles with radical ideas, liberty, equality, rational thought. The Enlightenment is in full swing, and the city's intellectuals are tossing around new concepts like hot coals at a philosophy barbecue. Meanwhile, downstairs, someone is hurling a chamber pot out a window. Because while the Enlightenment loved to talk about progress, no one was in a rush to clean up after it. Let's be honest, nothing highlights the contradiction of 18th century France quite like Voltaire scribbling about reason and reform, while his servant hauls a bucket of fermented breakfast out the back door. The philosophers were dazzling, articulate, witty, and deeply allergic to manual labor. They wanted to improve the soul of man, as long as someone else cleaned the privy. And yes, many of them had servants, some of whom doubled as informal waste managers. Night soil men by candlelight, if you will. After the guests left and the discourse cooled, someone still had to take care of the digestion aftermath. It wasn't just the upper crust either. Middle-class intellectuals, teachers, clerks, minor officials also aspired to Enlightenment ideals, while refusing to address the literal cesspit beneath their own homes. Some even wrote tracts about urban hygiene, without ever having stepped inside a latrine without gagging. One memorable case involved a pamphlet titled The Moral Cleanliness of the Republic, penned by a man named Claude Antoine Giroux. He advocated for civic order, cleanliness, and the moral purity of public spaces. His neighbors, meanwhile, lodged 5 complaints in 1 year about the state of his backyard pit, which reportedly overflowed during storms and contributed more to the community than his ideas ever did. And then there was the esteemed Monsieur Rousseau. Ah yes, Rousseau, the patron saint of natural living, child-rearing philosophies, and spectacular hypocrisy. He often ranted about civilization's corrupting influence, arguing that mankind was happiest in a state of nature. One might assume that meant he'd be comfortable hauling his own bucket. He was not. In fact, Rousseau routinely abandoned his children to orphanages, and depended on women and servants to maintain his very rustic, very curated version of independence. Meanwhile, State of Nature was alive and well just a few streets away in the gutters. The Enlightenment also brought about a surge in public discourse. Coffee houses buzzed with debate. Streets echoed with the rustle of pamphlets. And yet, despite all the ink spilled on metaphysics, politics and ethics, very little was said about the waste problem, except to complain about the smell. One could argue that Paris's sanitation system, or lack thereof, was the physical manifestation of its class structure. The thinkers lived above the waste, the workers lived in it, and while their words soared, the ground floor stayed wet. To be fair, some Enlightenment minds did try to tackle urban reform. There were calls for better drainage, more efficient cesspits, cleaner streets. But funding, implementation, actual consequences, those remained theoretical. And so, while noblemen sipped wine and speculated about the perfect republic, their excrement quietly fermented below. In this way, the Enlightenment became its own kind of joke. A city bursting with ideas, progress, and philosophical fireworks, built on a festering, unregulated infrastructure that made every summer a health crisis waiting to happen. It's almost poetic, a society obsessed with light, clarity, and order, yet utterly incapable of managing its own darkness, filth, and chaos. And at the bottom of this contradiction stood the night soil men, not quoted, not celebrated, not invited to salons, but working anyway. And ironically, they understood the Enlightenment better than anyone. Because while Rousseau was theorizing about mankind's social contract, the night soil men were living theirs. They upheld a necessary function, served a greater good, endured ridicule, and followed a code, even if it wasn't written in Latin. They believed in duty. They believed in community. They believed that if everyone dumped their waste in the street, someone had to carry it out. Maybe they didn't read Montesquieu, but they knew the value of balance. Maybe they didn't quote Diderot, but they understood systems, and maybe they couldn't debate Voltaire, but they could tell you exactly how many steps it took to carry a full bucket from the Rue du Temple to the nearest dump without losing a drop or your lunch. There's something bitterly elegant about it. The high thinkers wrote about ideals. The soil men lived in reality. One scribbled on parchment, the other wiped it off their boots. So the next time someone romanticizes Enlightenment Paris, the salons, the wit, the powdered perfection, remind them that right below those candlelit discussions, a man named Hanari was scooping warm truth into a cart and humming to himself, because philosophy doesn't pay the rent, and that, perhaps, is the most enlightened thought of all. Next up, we shift from metaphor to explosion. Because remember all that methane trapped in old pits? It didn't always stay quiet. There are many ways to die in 18th century Paris. Starvation, infection, a poorly timed political opinion. But perhaps the most unexpected and darkly spectacular was being blown sky-high by your own cesspit. Yes, dear listener. Today, we talk about explosions. Not gunpowder, not revolution. No, we're talking about the quiet, flammable menace lurking beneath Parisian floorboards, methane gas. Here's the science in its most fragrant form. When waste, human, animal, or political, is left to sit and ferment in a sealed environment like, say, a 300-year-old stone-lined pit beneath your bakery, it begins to break down. This produces methane, odorless, invisible, and extremely flammable. Combine that with other lovely gases like hydrogen sulfide and ammonia, and you've got the 18th century version of a ticking time bomb. All it needs is a spark. So what happens when that spark comes from a lantern, or a baker's oven, or, God help us, a pipe lit too close to the floor? Boom. Let's rewind to one of the most infamous incidents. The year 1772. The place, a modest boulangerie on Rue du Marché. The scene, a cozy storefront, beloved for its buttery croissants and unfortunate proximity to an ancient, poorly maintained cesspit. The bakery had been leaking for weeks. Not bread, gas. But of course no one knew that. They just thought the place smelled a bit strong, which, in Paris, wasn't exactly headline news. The baker, a man named Maurice, noticed the heat from his oven made the smell worse, but assumed it was just old flour and the faint trace of despair that clings to all carb-based businesses. Then one afternoon, Maurice did what he always did. He stoked the oven, tossed in a tray, lit the flame. The The building lifted off the ground. Neighbors described a dull thump, followed by the sound of pastry raining from the sky. The storefront shattered. Glass, dough, and wooden beams scattered in a perfect arc of culinary catastrophe. A large section of the street collapsed, revealing the very much still burning cesspit beneath. Miraculously, Maurice survived. He was found several feet away, dazed, covered in ash and flour, clutching a half-baked baguette like a newborn. His first words were reportedly, "That batch was nearly perfect." It wasn't the only explosion. Records, patchy though they are, mention at least 4 other methane-related incidents in late 18th century Paris. One took out a butcher's backroom. Another destroyed part of a convent kitchen. One poor fellow blew up his wine cellar while investigating a strange bubbling beneath the floor. The fourth, a public latrine near the Seine, that, quite literally, erupted. Several users were injured. One lost his trousers. No one ever sat there again. And yet, despite the danger, no real preventative measures were put in place. Why? Because city officials, nobles, and even engineers refused to believe something as intangible as gas could cause such damage. Fire? Sure. Structural failure? Definitely. But exploding poop? That was somehow too fantastical. One doctor theorized the real culprit was demonic combustion, caused by moral impurity and impure thoughts, specifically among bakers. Another blamed rebellious heat spirits. A third recommended building cesspits with less passionate architecture. Meanwhile, the night soil men knew exactly what was happening. They'd seen pits bubble. They'd heard them hiss. Some refused to work in certain cellars without first lighting a match and tossing it in. A crude, dangerous test. If nothing happened, they descended. If it exploded, they waited a few hours and tried again. Safety first. Others relied on instinct. If the air felt too warm or too silent, you backed away. Slowly, quietly. One man, Jacques the Nose Moreau, claimed he could smell the methane. He'd enter a cellar, sniff, and declare, "This one's got teeth." His record? 8 explosions avoided, 1 eyebrow lost. A small price to pay for legend status. The problem was, no one took these warnings seriously. The city was obsessed with philosophical combustion, revolution, liberty, fire in the soul, literal combustion. That was just bad luck. Of course, the risk wasn't just to buildings. It was to the men inside the pits. A single lantern, dropped into the wrong spot, could send flames racing up the walls, across the muck, and into the air, taking limbs, eyebrows, and lives with it. More than one raker bore burn scars. Some never came back out. But here's the kicker. Even after all this, there was no formal change in cesspit construction. No guidelines, no warnings posted on the walls. Paris simply carried on, like it always did, balancing genius and negligence on the edge of a matchstick. Because for every Voltaire preaching reason, there was a pit burping flammable gas beneath his salon. So yes, Paris exploded from time to time. Quietly, unexpectedly, gruesomely. And every time, the city swept it up, patched the hole, and sent in another crew. Progress, apparently, was not fireproof. Next we turned to innovation, or what passed for it in a world where toilets were considered a luxury item, because eventually someone did try to replace the shovel and the bucket with porcelain. For centuries, civilization relied on one sacred tool to manage human waste, the bucket. Wooden, leaky, occasionally gnawed by rats, but reliable. Then, slowly and with great suspicion, a revolution emerged, not of politics, not of philosophy, but of plumbing. The porcelain throne had entered the chat, but don't imagine a graceful transition. The rise of the toilet was less a triumphant march, and more a stumbling, leaky shuffle. Indoor plumbing in 18th century Paris arrived the way most meaningful change does. Too late for the rich, and with plenty of exploding prototypes. At first, only nobles and the wealthiest bourgeois families considered installing a water closet, and it wasn't out of concern for sanitation. It was about status. Having a room devoted to your bodily functions, with a pipe and everything, became a symbol of modernity. Some even called it hygienic luxury. Of course, the irony was that most early toilets were more symbolic than functional. Take the case of Madame du Fontenay, a widow of noble birth who had a marble-seated flush toilet installed in her second salon. Visitors were expected to admire it. But when the waste simply drained into a trench beneath the floorboards. The same trench servants had begged her to close years earlier because it regularly filled with groundwater. Naturally, the odor worsened. But Madame insisted it was the smell of progress. Spoiler, she moved out a month later. These early toilets weren't just rare, they were feared. Many Parisians believed indoor plumbing would bring disease into the house, not prevent it. The logic? If something that vile could travel out via a pipe, couldn't something worse travel in? Rats, demons, rebellious air, all considered legitimate concerns. One well-known pamphlet from 1790, on the menace of piped corruption, warned that underground water could carry foreign ailments and low-class essence directly into noble homes. One man even claimed his wife fell ill from vapor envy, a term he coined to describe lower-class gases entering through shared sewage pipes. No, it didn't catch on. Meanwhile, night soil men began to feel the pressure. Not from society still mostly ignored them, but from progress itself. In neighborhoods where toilets appeared, cesspits were drained less often. Some were sealed, a few even had their entrances bricked up. For the men whose livelihoods depended on daily shoveling, this was bad news. Some transitioned to other trades, chimney sweeps, porters, gravediggers. Others stubbornly held on, confident that Paris would eventually realize the toilet was just a passing fad. Jean, our infamous survivor of the cesspit plunge, didn't live long enough to see toilets become mainstream, but his son, Etienne, did. By 1815, Etienne had noticed his roots shrinking. Whole alleys once rich with waste were now eerily dry. He tried adapting, offered cleaning consultations to the new toilet owners, suggested maintenance packages. It didn't work. The rich wanted engineers now, not rakers. By 1830, Etienne hung up his shovel. His grandson, Luc, would go on to become a teacher, the first in the family to own a coat without a shovel loop stitched into the back. The transition was slow, uneven, and wildly unequal. For every salon with a porcelain seat, there were 10 slums with overflowing barrels. While the rich embraced plumbing and took credit for inventing cleanliness, the poor were still ankle-deep in runoff. In fact, many tenement blocks didn't get indoor plumbing till decades later, and when they did, the installations were often shared, unventilated, and barely functional. So progress arrived, just not for everyone. Still, the shift was irreversible. Toilets grew sleeker, water pressure improved, engineers developed the siphon. Paris even began to build a proper sewer system, deep, dark, and large enough to walk through, though you wouldn't want to. And as the new system grew, the bucket shrank. One by one, the night soil men disappeared. Not in a dramatic blaze of glory, but in a quiet fade. No statues, no parades, just jobs that didn't need doing anymore. One shovel retired, one cart abandoned, a pit sealed with brick and silence. Let's pause here, because this is where the story changes. From squalor to sanitation, from anonymous drudgery to running water, from the clang of iron rakes to the whisper of a flush. Jean's grandson, Luc, would one day sit on a toilet his grandfather wouldn't have recognized. White, smooth, cold in winter, clean in ways the old world never imagined. He'd write poems beside it, eat bread within sight of it, never once fear that it might explode beneath him. And he'd flush, without thinking. That's progress. Subtle, imperfect, often forgetful of the people it replaces. Next we ask the real question, what does it all mean? What did the night soil men leave behind, besides the obvious? So, what did it all mean? After 15 chapters of grime, methane, and metaphorical explosions, you might be wondering, was there a point to all this? Beyond the buckets, beyond the stench, beyond poor Jean and his nostril of steel? Yes, there was. And you've probably been sitting on it the whole time, quite literally if you're watching this on the toilet. Let's start with the obvious. Civilization, that fancy word we like to throw around when we want to feel important, is propped up on the backs of invisible labourers. Not thinkers, not monarchs, not powdered dandies sipping absinthe and quoting Rousseau, but workers, the ones who do the dirty jobs no one wants to talk about. The night soil men were essential, not metaphorically, literally. Without them, Paris would have drowned in its own waste decades before the revolution ever sparked. And yet, they weren't celebrated, weren't thanked, weren't even acknowledged. In most city records, they're lumped into vague line items like external maintenance or night duties. You can almost hear the archivist gagging as they wrote it. But here's the thing, those men didn't just clean cesspits. They kept the city standing. Every home, every inn, every baker's stall, every perfumed salon, all of them functioned because someone else was willing to descend into the rot, quietly, night after night. And that's the first lesson. Essential work is rarely glamorous. In fact, the more vital the job, the more likely it is to be underpaid, ignored, or actively despised. Sound familiar? Let that sink in. Now take a breath. Not too deep. We are still in 18th century Paris. Second lesson. Dignity doesn't come from title or fame. It comes from doing what needs to be done, even when nobody's watching, especially when nobody's watching. Jean, who fell into a cesspit and crawled back out with a story instead of a lawsuit, never published a book. He never gave a speech, but he raised a family. He showed up to work. He carried the weight, literal and societal, so others didn't have to. That's quiet heroism. And no, it doesn't come with medals. It comes with bad knees, ruined boots, and a kind of nobility that doesn't fit in history textbooks. We live in a world that often confuses visibility with value. We reward the loudest voice, the brightest screen, the flashiest job title. But the night soil men remind us, just because something happens in the dark, doesn't mean it doesn't matter. So yeah, maybe you've never thought about where your waste goes. Maybe you've never thanked the people who make sure your city doesn't smell like fermented despair. Maybe you've never noticed the quiet hands that keep things running while you sleep. But that's the final lesson here. You're standing on someone else's work. Every sidewalk, every pipe, every structure that doesn't cave in when it rains. It all exists because someone made it, cleaned it, or maintained it. And maybe, just maybe, remembering that can make us a little more humble, a little more grateful, a little more willing to acknowledge the people who clean up after civilization, even when civilization forgets their names. So as the buckets fade, the toilets flush, and the sewers hum quietly beneath your feet, remember the men who walked before you, boots thick with the past, backs bent with purpose, and eyes always half closed from the fumes. They weren't saints, they weren't saviors, they were just men with shovels. And somehow that was enough to keep Paris from collapsing into itself. In our final chapter, we offer a quiet tribute, one that smells less like satire and more like truth. Because sometimes, the most important history isn't the prettiest. It's the kind you can't scrub out of the stones. Let's dim the lanterns for a moment. Not for drama though, let's be honest. We've earned a bit of flair. But for reverence. Because beneath the sarcasm, under the filth, past the jokes about exploding toilets and fermented regrets, there's a heartbeat. A steady, quiet rhythm. The rhythm of work done when no one's watching. Of footsteps echoing down cobbled alleys at 2 a.m, of shovels scraping stone while the city sleeps. These were the quiet heroes of the cesspits. Men like Jean and Etienne, and the hundreds more whose names we'll never know, because no one thought to write them down. They didn't get statues, or gravestones, or ballads sung about their bravery, their legacy. It's buried under the foundations of every modern city, wiped away with each flush, silenced by progress. And yet, they endure. Because even as technology replaced their tools, their labor built the bones of sanitation. They taught us, through gritted teeth and blistered hands, what society conveniently forgets, that you can't have beauty without maintenance. You can't have elegance without effort. And you sure as hell can't have the city of lights without someone cleaning the shadows. These men, and the women too, behind the walls, laundering the soiled linens, boiling the waste-stained garments, scrubbing and bleaching without ever being asked their names, made it possible for Paris to become Paris, for philosophers to ponder in peace, for kings to sit on velvet cushions, for lovers to stroll past fountains and remark on the scent of roses, unaware of the stink, just a layer beneath the cobblestones. The night soil crews didn't ask for gratitude, but they deserved it. Their stories are poems written in grime. Verse by verse, they carved dignity out of degradation. They turned rot into ritual, suffering into survival. Every step they took was a step away from chaos, a step toward modernity, even if modernity never turned back to thank them. So here we are, at the end. We've waded through the worst Paris had to offer. We've fallen into pits, exploded bakeries, dodged noble flatulence, and carried buckets through moonlit alleys. And through it all, we met the people who kept the gears turning, not with grand speeches or noble blood, but with work, real work, the kind that doesn't trend, the kind that doesn't sparkle, the kind that leaves a mark you can't see but will always smell if it goes undone. That's the legacy of the night soil men. So tonight, as you brush your teeth in your pristine bathroom, with your scented soap and gentle lighting and a flush that whisks everything away with effortless grace, maybe pause, maybe listen. Somewhere in the pipes, if you really strain your ears, you can still hear it. The scrape of a shovel, the soft grunt of a man lifting a bucket, the whisper of boots on stone. It's faint, almost forgotten, but it's there, because history isn't always about crowns or coups or powdered wigs delivering manifestos. Sometimes it's about the people who carried the weight of it all, while the rest of us slept, and that's worth remembering. History isn't always pretty, but it's real. So if this made you laugh, cringe, or appreciate indoor plumbing just a little more, like, subscribe, and light a candle for